do if your step-parent takes over your parent's house when they die and leaves it to their own kids? Why are interest rates so low, on savings accounts anyway? And are KiwiSaver providers making their returns sound better than they are? That's some of what we're looking at on this week's No Stupid Questions. I'm RNZ's money correspondent Susan Edmonds. I'm joined by Justin Gregory.
Hello, we're doing step family stuff again this week. Didn't we just do that last time?
Or the week before, but recently.
No, Anyway, I've got a great stepdad. How you doing, Baz? Love you.
Aw,
No.
cute. Our first question this week is one that sort of goes to the heart of the economic situation we're in at the moment, the unemployment rate. Specifically, what does the unemployment rate actually tell us, and what is it leaving out?
It tells us how many people are unemployed.
You might think that, yes, but it's actually not as clear as all that. To answer this one, I chatted to Northland's favourite economist, Brad Olsen.
So the question is, what does the unemployment rate actually show us? Because it's not as straightforward as just who is out of work, right?
Correct. And the reason for that is because there's a number of people who might not be in employment, but they shouldn't necessarily be counted as unemployed because otherwise the numbers would look silly. For example, if you took all of the people who have just had children, mums at home who are looking after kids, they probably couldn't do a job, days after giving birth. You shouldn't count them as unemployed because they're not really potential people who could be working to quite the same degree. You probably wouldn't count prisoners because they might not have a job, but you're probably not going to see them on the work side immediately. You might not have university students or similar who are at school, or those who are at high school. If they're engaged in high school, sometimes they might be looking and have a part-time job, but they're unlikely to, every single one of them, have a full-time job. So adding all those numbers together and just looking at the number of people that don't have a job full stop would misrepresent the unemployment rate. And the reason for that is we use the unemployment rate to try and understand, well, effectively, how much capacity is there out there in the labour force? What if we look at the sort of the working part of the population? What's the potential there that we look at, which is why the unemployment rate looks at the number of unemployed people. And to be unemployed, you have to be without a job, so no hours at all. You also have to be available for work, so you can start within the next 4 weeks. And you've got to be actively seeking work. So that means you've got to be either calling potential employers, dropping a CV off. You've got to be applying for jobs. You can't just be browsing, an online site and going, oh, that job looks interesting, but I'm not going to apply. You're not really actively seeking work at that point. And so we take those people that don't have jobs under those criteria and we divide that by the labour force. So the total number of people who are either in jobs or who are unemployed and still looking and available for work. We discount the other group. The third major group is what we call the not in labour force group. It's all those people that don't currently have employment but aren't looking or available, which is one of the reasons that often when we're looking at that not in labour force group and we try to understand the flows between that not in labour force group and unemployment, we're trying to figure out how many people have been discouraged from looking for work, because you can sometimes see a number of people that they might have been looking for work for 6 months, they've found it too difficult, all of a sudden they say, look, it's just too hard, it's not worth my while trying to do this all the time, so I'm going to disengage a bit more. They then fall out of the unemployment rate, they fall into the not in labour force group, and that can, at times, artificially mean that the unemployment rate is lower than we might have first expected.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And so that's why in the most recent data, the unemployment rate went up, but the number of people working actually increased. Is that right?
Correct. So we saw, a decent lift in the number of people who were actually working and had jobs. There was an increase in people that got employment. It's just that there was an even larger increase in the total labour force overall. That's because you had both population growth, but also a number of people, I think it was something like 6 or so thousand, might have been a bit more than that actually, who moved from the not in labour force group to unemployed, effectively because they started looking for work again. They all of a sudden, they were available in the next 4 weeks and they were actively seeking work. And part of that at the moment with where the labour market is in New Zealand is because we think that there are a few more job opportunities starting to show through, often more part-time than full-time. But when a few more opportunities start to show through, a few more people start to go, oh, maybe it is worth me now putting in a job application, whereas before I was disinterested and disengaged. So that did lift the unemployment rate to 5.4%, but it's also why and most economists actually think the labour market numbers below the headline looked all right. It wasn't because lots more people lost jobs, it's more that the job increases were not enough to support all of those who are immediately looking for work. Probably just one final point, and that's that it's one of the reasons that we often look at other measures than just the unemployment rate. The likes of the underutilisation rate gives us a slightly broader view of the labour market. It includes those who don't have jobs formally under, the unemployed criteria. It looks at those who do have jobs but not enough hours for what they want. That's the underemployed. And then we've also got the potential labour force, which are those who probably could well get pushed into work if they needed to, but for one reason or another, they don't fit the formal unemployment criteria. So the underutilisation rate gives us a broader view of sort of capacity in the labour market. It's also the definitions around the unemployment rate is also why we're a little bit careful when it comes to particularly the youth unemployment rate. It can look quite high, but part of that is because the actual number of people who are actively in the labour force is a bit reduced because you have school students and otherwise who a lot of the time fall into that not in labour force group, and it can mean that the numbers sometimes look a little bit all over the place when it comes to some of those smaller demographic subsets.
That was Brad Olsen, who I'm pretty sure is a graduate of Whangarei Boys High, or an alumni, is that what we call it?
Okay, we've got a question that's a bit of a continuation of last week's theme around the difficulties that can arise with blended families. The listener, whom we are not identifying for obvious reasons because it's New Zealand and someone will know her, says her father died in 2015. While he was sick, Dad and his partner both wrote wills. In Dad's will, he said if he died, the house he built would be sold after the stepmother died, and the money would be divided up between the listener, her sisters, and her 3 stepsisters. So both Dad and his partner wrote matching wills. Now, the stepmother lived in the house at least a year after Dad passed and then sold it and bought another house. She changed her will so only her children would get the money, the 3 stepsisters, from the house sale. What can our listener do in a situation like this, Susan?
Some of this stuff can be so complicated because there's the emotional stuff on top of the financial stuff, and it can get quite unpleasant. I went to my usual source for help on this, Michelle Pope, who's principal trustee from Public Trust. She says you should start by getting a copy of your father's will and understanding how the home was owned when he died. Did they own it jointly? In which case it just goes straight to the stepmother and isn't part of his estate. She can then do what she likes with it, and your father was just trusting that it would be the right thing for you too. Or he was more concerned about looking after her, which is legitimate, I guess. Or did they own it as tenants in common or something like that? Because if they did, his share might have been part of his estate and protected for the beneficiaries in the will. Your stepmother might have had the right to live in it as long as she needed to, even in that situation. Michelle says whether you have any legal interest in your stepmother's new home depends on what interest you had in your dad's estate. It's possible that if your stepmother had a life interest that gave her the right to sell the initial property and buy another, your dad's interest may have transferred to that replacement property. She says you could speak to the executor of your father's estate, who would have been responsible for administering his will, and you could then seek legal advice if you're not happy with the information you've got.
Okay, now a slightly complicated question, because the previous question wasn't complicated at all. Clive says, Clive, good name. I'm a personal investor and an active one. I do it because I love it. I have a problem, though, with the managed fund industry and that they are very careless with the truth. Clive says that, not me. When they claim to have achieved a return of, say, 8%, if they've been investing in New Zealand shares, they should say that the client has contributed 4% or 6% from the dividends they have foregone. Susan, what is this question actually asking and what's going on here? Because I'm deeply confused trying to read it out.
This is referring to whether the dividends that you get from investments are included in the total return that a manager claims to be getting from investing or not. So when you buy, a share in a company, you usually get ongoing dividends from that, as well as the appreciation in share price that you'd see. New Zealand has two main types of managed funds: accumulating and distributing. KiwiSaver funds are accumulating funds, so they reinvest that dividend that you get back into the fund rather than paying it out to investors. And when accumulating funds talk about the returns they're giving investors, they include the dividends that are reinvested. If a fund pays out, when it reports returns, it includes the dividend in that return. Rupert Carlyon, who's founder of Kora KiwiSaver, talked to me about this and pointed out that the NZX 50 is an index that includes dividends in its return calculations, but the S&P 500 is not. It only includes the price movements. And lots of New Zealand equities do tend to be quite dividendish. He says Clive has a point because he actually thinks it's fund managers who are doing it correctly. Maybe he would say that, I'm not sure. And it's actually individual investors who should be crediting themselves with a slightly higher return by considering their dividends as well.
All right, thirdly, and a slightly less complicated question, but hear the outrage in this question. Now, Richard wants to know, how can banks justify paying only 0.10% interest on an account that is designed for saving? It's almost not worth having this as an alternative to a standard transaction account, says Richard furiously. He says when you look at what is being charged on a mortgage, a savings account might be paying a third of that. It's almost as if banks don't want your money anymore, says Richard, and would rather lend you money to get back interest. In the old days, says Richard, you were encouraged to save and watch your money compound with interest earned. But at 0.10% or even 1.6%, how long is that going to take? Richard says, I know there is a term deposit option, which we use extensively ourselves for some interest income, but getting to the term deposit threshold takes some time for most people. Richard asks, is there no longer the encouragement to save? He remembers in primary school he used to have an ASB savings bank savings book, but 0.10%? What is that for a joke? Says Richard.
I remember those ASB savings books.
Yeah,
I don't know
me
when
too.
they phased those out. But people are sometimes shocked when they discover how little they can get from savings accounts. I looked at this recently, actually, and we talked about it. There are some offering less than 0.1%, which I agree is pretty meagre. Part of that is just that customers don't notice the interest that they're getting, I think, so there's not that pressure on banks to compete that there might be with home loans, although they're more competing with the cashback at the moment, but that's another story. And maybe it seems like a hassle to shift. People like to have some of their money in an account that's accessible and more accessible than a term deposit. In general, we shouldn't be using these savings accounts for long-term stuff, because if you have money that you don't immediately need, you should be locking it away in somewhere like a term deposit or a managed fund to get a higher return. But as Richard says, you have to get to a certain amount to get to the level where it's worth doing that, or even where you can. So some people will be building their savings in savings accounts. I guess the best advice is to shop around. There are some interest rates that are higher. You can get over 2% in some cases, which is still not amazing, but better. And if banks notice they're losing deposits to higher paying accounts, maybe it might motivate them to act, perhaps.
Perhaps. Susan, in your columns this week, you've looked a bit at pets in rental properties. Why and what's going on?
Well, we're a couple of months into the new rules, so I thought I'd have a look and see how it's all going. Since December 1st, tenants have been able to request a pet, and landlords have only been able to say no with reasonable grounds. And if they accept a pet, they can charge a pet bond of up to 2 weeks' rent on top of the normal bond. And last week, there had been 2,379 of those lodged.
That's a big number. So is it working then? People are getting to have pets in their rental properties?
Yeah, I think it is a big number, but I have seen a stat that 40% of households have a pet, so we're not quite there yet. And there are some problems. For tenants, there's a concern that people with pets could be discriminated against in the application process. Some people are actually advising tenants not to reveal their pet until they've secured the property, because at that point the landlord has to consider it, whereas earlier they could give any reason for saying no, so that's a bit dodgy. And the other side is that some landlords are being caught out because they haven't realised they actually can't say, no pets as a blanket rule anymore. And that's taking a bit of getting used to for some people. I do think it's positive, though, that we move in the direction of having decent conversations about this, because so many New Zealand households have a pet, want a pet. I'm an evil landlord myself, and we're fine with a tenant having a cat because, it's their home. When I was flatting, I had a cat, and I moved so many times, but every time I moved, it was like, there's my cat, so here's my home.
So that brings us now to our question for the listener for this week. What's the most expensive pet procedure that Southern Cross Pet Insurance has covered in the last year? I hate to think. Susan.
Yes, a luxating patella perhaps. I'm side-eyeing my dog right now who's lining up for an expensive operation. Send your answers as well as any questions you have to questions@rnz.co.nz.
And last week we asked you what cars cost on average in 1983, a time when the Ford Cortina, marvellous car, reigned supreme.
We reckon a new one would have set you back between $10,000 and $15,000. Cars are a funny one. I saw a report from 2014 that said new car prices were down 77% since 1994. Apparently, in 1994, a new Toyota Corolla sedan was priced at about $31,000. And that's actually not that far off the price now, despite 30 years of inflation in between. So not everything gets more expensive over time. Just most things. No Stupid Questions with Susan Edmonds was written and presented by Susan Edmonds. That's me. Justin Gregory is the producer. The engineer is Steve Burridge. Thanks to Clive, Richard and our anonymous listener for their questions, and Brad Olson, Michelle Pope and Rupert Carlyon for their answers. Follow and listen to No Stupid Questions with Susan Edmonds on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or any podcast app so you don't miss an episode. Bye for now.